say, look, at present, when they would be building logical, attempted thinking machines, even when they're operating at their best three-dimensional speed, you've got three possibilities coming out of these so-called machines. We're not picking on the machines, we're not picking on the builders. It is yet to be ascertained exactly whom we're picking on. Because I know people are just seeing this tape for the first time or the second time in some other locale and some other time frame. They always think they know who's being picked on. Sometimes it's them, and when it's not them, it's people that they think are dumber than they are. It has not been ascertained, trust me, who we're picking on. All right, back to the machines. They've got three possibilities. The way that they can build them now, which is one step up from what they were for a while. Three possibilities of the machine reacting, talking back. Three possible responses, and they go definitely true, definitely false, and insufficient data. Under all ordinary spatial conditions, the last one, of course, in essence, is saying that there is no additional info possible. There will be no additional data forthcoming. There will be no enlightening, enlarging response because of insufficient data. With a certain kind of more universal intelligence, the area that would seem to want to say insufficient data would be the very place that a more radical intelligence, rather than finding a spot of no additional info, it would be, may I say, to say the least, otherwise. Where spatially no new info is possible, all info is temporarily possible. Some of your brains should enjoy tonight, if not immediately, sometime later, because it is not simply pulling apart and reversing, trying to get your own intellect to move up to the point that you can take that which would seem to be either definitely false, definitely true, and when you get really good, when it seems to be insufficient data, but at least for the first two, that they are insufficiently data-based. Even when the information, even when the machinery of life, even when the machinery of your own, let's assume reasonable, sane nervous system at that time sends back the message, definitely false. When spatially no new information seems available, it does not seem possible, all information is then coevally, all of it is then temporally possible. The expansion of your own personal information structure, your own database, it's only impossible to expand it when your thinking processes are spatially based. It is only there that binary thinking can thrive and breed. That's the only place. That's the only place that any machine, any system, any organization, any organism in a 3D reality, in an unknown, unrecognized, even 4D, because they're still taking the fourth dimension, calling it time, they're still taking it spatially. It is only when your thinking processes, which everybody's are on that basis under any ordinary conditions, is only when they're spatially based that the structure is limited, that the information, the database, is limited. It is only there that you can be ignited in such a way that your reaction, your own brain's reaction to any question, any offering of some information or observation will come back one of the three possibilities. And as all of you should know quite easily by now, is generally the first two, either definitely true or definitely false. When it's insufficient data under most ordinary conditions under which people are wired up to operate in life, when it's insufficient data, you are generally speaking, generally, almost all the time, generally, you are dealing with situations wherein you apparently had no particular personal interest. Therefore, the idea that your own brain sends back the information of saying, well, it's got insufficient data, you do not think about this way. It is not talked about even in your own internal dialogue, but what it amounts to is if you did give it any notice, it's like, well, who cares? I can make up examples from all throughout backward history right into present times. It's like you hearing some commentator regarding current events in Northern Ireland, Lebanon, anywhere, and they point out that if only such and such would happen, if only these factions would get together, and if only they do this and that, we believe that something might happen. And if you were listening at all, and let's assume that you are wired up under ordinary conditions, that you got no particular interest in that, but you just happened to hear a little bit of it, maybe somebody was there with you and said, boy, what do you think about that continuing conflict between the so-called Christians and the so-called Muslims over there in Lebanon? What's your opinion? And you're just vaguely aware that the person was reacting to something they just heard on the news, and if you responded at all, your response might be, you know, like, I don't know enough to comment. What you're saying is, I don't care. I don't keep up with that. So what you are generally dealing with, as you should know from your own experience, is you are generally dealing with your own thinking machine that's sending back, if it seems to have any passion, if it seems to have some pertinence to you, then the response is going to generally come back one of the first two. Definitely true, definitely false. But I was trying to be somewhat magnanimous, and if a machine that humans build, just ordinary humans, people that even sunk so low as to graduate from MIT and Southern Cal, they built this machine. If the machine can give three responses and one of them can be insufficient data, let's be broad-minded and assume that periodically some humans actually try to think about something and their own response seems to come back as insufficient data. I don't know enough. And that would seem, by any reasonable three-dimensional reality, to preclude any immediate profit. I have insufficient data, I can't go on. It is otherwise if you know what you're doing in a non-linear way. For it to be to the point of insufficient data, that is the response, that if you had to put a name on it at that time, that's the response that comes back, that is prime time. Because if you, under the ordinary conditions, are faced with spatially limited flows of energy, flows of information that seems to be going through your thinking processes, that this is insufficient data, I cannot come up with new information, that is the time that if you can get outside of linear spatial thinking, that is the time that all information, not some, that's when all kinds of things are possible. If I could sort of quote myself, several tapings back, under partially diverse circumstance, verbally, I point out something like this, that if I didn't, I'm going to play like I did, so you play along. This would sound like a reasonable quote. This would sound like something that I and many of you could take off on and preach a sermon. Could say that if you do not know from what position you're looking, it's real hard to tell whether you're seeing the front of something, the back of it, the beginning, the end, the left-hand side, the right-hand side. Well, that would seem, if you think about it, if you followed that, would be self-evident to ordinary thought, that if you don't know where you are, if you're out trying to reconnoiter for your state, for the king, You can't go back and report the kinds of troop movements. You can't even tell whether the opposing side is withdrawing some of the troops, making a retreat, whether they're advancing, or you can't go back and say, well, they're actually trying to get on our flanks. And the king says, well, in which direction? Well, I don't know. Because if you didn't know where you were, if you can't look at a map, whether it be physically on a piece of paper or back in here if you're doing it with yourself, and say, well, I was up on this little grassy knoll, this little tree, and I looked over there, and I know it was northeast. And then they could figure, right? So if you don't know where you are, if you do not have a known position, then whatever it is you're looking at is always, to say the least, ambiguous. You don't know whether you're seeing the front of it, the west side, the east side, etc., right? All right. No. Could you see that from a more universal position, if you could free yourself from that kind of literal, internal, spatial position, you could then access more universal views to wherein you would have, what I was saying was all, but you would at least, if that sounds too bombastic, you would have a plurality, a multiplicity of views. Not just the front, not just a question of is this the front or the back. It could be, yeah. Okay, both. Or am I looking at the east side or the west side? Right. Did you see the beginning of it or the end of it? How did you guess? But you could then have access to observations as long as you do not have a known, a fixed spatial position from which you are looking. Then what you have the possibility of is surveying surprising points, views, descriptions, and possibilities. And I was going to push on in a slightly different direction, but I wanted to see if, rhetorically, if I could ask, how many people, don't raise your hand, raise your brain level, begin to find that there is real energy, not just a laugh, but in being able to think of something, to take a view, whether it would seem to be an ordinary view that you have perhaps never enunciated to yourself directly that way, or something you just heard, or something you just read, and you went, yeah, that is so axiomatic. The turn of phrase is so blithe and cute, I'd like to remember that. But then, to be able to immediately recognize the opposite of it, might as well be Boris Goodenough, or whatever, a graceful dancer. His name's not Boris, is it? Bubba Goodenough. That you can take something that would strike you as, hey, such as one I just did, that if you do not know from what position you're looking, you can't really ascertain where you are. That is what you're seeing. It's valueless. You don't know whether you're seeing the beginning of something, the west side, the top, the bottom, the east side, the end of it, the middle. That's just true everywhere in life. You couldn't even go in and watch a movie unless there's some place, if you don't have any fixed position, you could leave and have wasted your $8 or $10 that you ended up looking at the wall. And maybe later somebody says, what do you think of that movie? And you got to say, well, I always kind of like a lot of Hill's films, but that one was just, it left me just kind of blank, so to speak. So that would sound as though it is, without any doubt, perhaps a slightly new or an interesting statement of the obvious, that you have got to know where you are to have some idea of what you're looking at, besides the preposition at the end of the sentence. But can you see, can you start doing this on your own, that in the 3D world, just reverse that? That, of course, is not the end of the reality of it, it's not even the beginning of it. But in any 3D, verbal, reasonable sense, just reverse that. And it's equally, just immediately, there's nothing to figure out. Not if you're wired up at all to pursue this sort of activity. The opposite is true, but in a way that would never seethe out under ordinary conditions. There's no way that your ordinary intellect would one day go, boy, if you don't know where you are, you can really tell a lot more. You know, you'd probably want to go, if you did think that, or if your brain did, you wouldn't, if you're ordinary, you wouldn't take credit. You would think, well, it's this Indian summer, the heat got me, or I didn't eat this morning. I need to go lay down and put a cold towel on my head. The validity is somewhere. The reason I started off tonight about the 3 possible responses from prime thinking, attempted thinking machines, has a third possibility of insufficient data, that it cannot make a dogmatic decision that what I'm hearing, what you're asking me to consider, what you're asking me to compute is definitely true, definitely false. The other possibility is I will not step into that sort of trap, because that's not always possible when you do not have sufficient data, according to the way I'm wired up, the way I'm programmed, to make a decision. Now that passes, even for a little machine, compared to where they started out. You could say, well, that is an improvement. That machine may not be thinking. You know, not in the sense that, you know, real smart people like real smart people, that you can say, well, that's not thinking. But you could say that, relatively speaking, which is all you can say in the 3D world anyway, that this thing is in some way superior than its predecessors several generations back in the attempted thinking machine, because then they would just say definitely true or definitely false. But now this one will say insufficient data, cannot decide, will not mislead you, cannot decide. That would seem to be some fairly stable statement of local reality to ordinary people, probably of reality, of an intellectual, more intelligent view than would be some die-hard, dichotomy-minded person that would just say, well, it's either yes or no. It would pass. Surely you see where I'm pointing. It could pass under general genteel conditions as being a slight improvement, that the machine at least is programmed to where it will say, well, without sufficient data, I don't care to put my foot in it. I'm not going to mislead you people. That same thing, if you can get beyond that level in your own brain, not of listening to me, not just reading some book, but if you can begin to do it, the antipodal view of that is equally as valid, except you would never see it under ordinary conditions, because under ordinary conditions the opposite is definitely false. Because once you have said that you cannot ascertain points, you cannot make correct, dependable observations and reports on what you're observing if you do not know the position from which you're observing. Now anybody knows that. Illiterates know that. Bricklayers even know that. Probably some engineers and attorneys may know that. Probably some physicians know, that you got to know where you are right now to know where to start looking for an appendix. You got to know where you are in relationship to the corpus here. Equally, in a way that is definitely false, but equally true, is to escape. Part of the way to try and escape that kind of hold is to realize that when you're at the point not only of it being, according to your own nervous system, definitely true or definitely false, that's nothing to struggle with that, but to the point that there seems to be insufficient data, that there is no way. I'm getting so smart now, I will not fall in that trap of hearing somebody's idea or hear something about some other religion or some crackpot idea about economics, instead of me immediately going, boy, what a crackpot idea, that is definitely false. To say, well, no, wait. Something in life, something that life needs, is making some guy in a position to get this kind of forum for me to hear about, to make that kind of statement. And for me to consider it crackpot, something else is going on, I could learn something. That's child's play. Although in ordinary life it's not, but that should be child's play even now. It's to the point where it seems to be insufficient data that I will not immediately attack that. I know that that serves no purpose. I'm simply trying to mechanically put a period at the end of a sentence, and it will cut down the possibility of me seeing anything else, assuming there's something else to see. If you start treating it all, not just as though I'm going to go against my automatic reaction to think this is true or false, consider that I have insufficient data to ever decide, or at least to presently decide, whether something is definitely true or definitely false. Therefore, insufficient data, right? Put a comma on it and relax. No. No. That's the place that you can jump out of spatial thinking. No longer thinking in space, you can start thinking in the future. Because if you can get away from the spatial position that I do have some position, I've got to, which ordinary people do, that is here. There is some place from which I'm looking. And when I'm now talking for ordinary intelligence, remember, that it can say, look, you, as me, or somebody can attack me and say that I had the wrong education. You can laugh because I went to the University of North Carolina instead of the University of South Carolina. You can say that I have some kind of slight brain damage just because of that unfortunate episode I had as a child with the bulldozer. You can say all that, but I'm doing the best I can. And for anybody to think, no matter what their genetic possibilities seem to be, or what their cultural IQ seems to be, or any other thing they can come up with as an attempted measurement, everyone would say, I'm speaking now for everyone's average intelligence, ordinary intelligence, that you have got to have some position or you couldn't think. It doesn't matter whether the position in some way can be attacked as being invalid or fallacious or illogical. That doesn't matter. I could not even think. I could not even think and be illogical unless I had some position. And if it's pointed out to me as illogical, then perhaps I can improve myself and widen my horizons and the little alligator. So, it is true that spatially, under ordinary conditions, spatially, here there's a place to where you have to go. There is a place wherever it is. Wherever you think you have started off a new sentence. Every reaction you have, every time you respond to what seems to either be your own internal dialogue or what seems to be the occurrences in the environment, you are responding like an attempted thinking machine of some kind. And wherever you, in whatever way you're responding, it is in a sense spatially. Because you're responding from somewhere in your own brain of, well, wait a minute, this is definitely false. And of course, all kinds of small variations. This is probably false. I decided this was false a long time ago. I'm not sure I know, but everyone I know says that's false, so that's good enough for me. All of that requires that there be a place spatially from which you are thinking. If you could think in the future, whatever the hell that might mean, if you could do that, you would not have a position. Then the idea of insufficient data becomes really something different. It should be, the phrase should then be something close to this. It should be insufficient data cubed. Because it's not, as you should know, it's not simply insufficient data. Because if that is literally all it is, then what I'd be staying here for the last 20 minutes talking about is the great improvement it would have to intelligence if you knew less. Which, even with you people, I'm not prepared to go that far. So it obviously, I'm inferring something additional to that. But it is not far removed, as always, from the three-dimensional description of insufficient data. It's just not that, and it's not just the opposite. It's that if you find the curve on it, that kind of non-abrasive kind of saddle point, or where a Mobius begins to turn into a Klein bottle, and it begins to turn into soupy sales as intellectual humor. It is taking any idea that there is an ordinary representation of it. Insufficient data is an absolutely necessary idea, concept, piece of energy in ordinary life. The opposite of it is not what I'm talking about. It itself is not what I'm talking about. But there is an extension of that. And that's what I was trying to give you some idea, to say that if you were in a place that you were thinking temporally, that is, there was not spatial thought, that you were not somewhere to where it was even possible to say this is definitely true, this is definitely false, or this definitely, as smart as I am, this definitely offers insufficient data for me to make a decision. No, it's right. It's right if you could, if that was you, the paper, if you could hold it up to the paper, and what you wrote down here, what you drew down here, and you went, well, look, that would be close if you didn't look at this actually as being spatially, as going from here. If I drew a face and I drew some information down here, or the equation and that, and the face said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, look, if you could not just take this as being a spatial gap from the face there to here, look at it as this continuous, it's all existing in time. It is not a spatial difference. But it is, if that's as far as you can think, because you have to start there and you have to look somewhere and go, well, all right, it's got to be true. It's got to be false. It's got to be good. It's got to be bad. It's got to be heads. It's got to be tails. All of that is true only if you're thinking spatially. That's the only way you can think that way. And so it's not wrong. If you could not do it that way, you couldn't have gotten here tonight. You couldn't do other important things. You couldn't get home tonight. You wouldn't be able to work up and pay your income taxes next year. So it's necessary that you be able to do that. But there are limits, and you surpass the limits the first time you thought, or you hit the wall. It has not changed. Ever since then, it's all been spatial thinking. That's what education is. No attack on education, but that's all education is of all kinds on this planet. Because the only thing you can learn once you learn the second word. Once you have begun to talk, that is, once you have begun to have a linear, spatial, operational top of the nervous system, known as the cerebral part of the brain, once these frontal lobes are a little glowing, sparking, churning out, once that happens, you cannot expand what you understand. You cannot expand what you see. Everything that you get after that are simply new spatial views. And it is always pivoted on how your nervous system is already wired up. And for those of you who may be seeing this at other times and other places on the tape, I can't argue and wrestle, or I'm not going to tonight. I'm just going to have to tell you what you are wired up to be is what you are. So those of you who want to go home and think that's your mother's fault or was the fault that the Bolsheviks actually won back in 1917, or that if they'd just given Mussolini more of a chance, or that Genghis wasn't such a bad guy. You can think anything you want to, but if you are already wired up and you start to think, and you're wired up if you start to think, then you had your spatial position, and it has not changed. All the views that you have, all of the education, I'm not talking about just some kind of crackpot opinion. I'm talking about what you learned, that you went and paid somebody to make you read books. What do they call it? School, college, and that stuff. And they tested you. They tested you spatially. You thought they were asking questions about history and biology. They were spatial questions. They wanted to know whether you had gone from the front of that book to the back of the book. And they wanted to know that your view in some way coincided with the general view of that university. That is, were you all using the English alphabet? Were you all right with the tip of the pencil and not the eraser? And that I, the professor, hands out and you answer the questions, hand them back. That they just want to know that you are operating in the same kind of dimensional framework as they. So it's all spatial. So everything that you have known, you cannot move that kind of wall. That kind of thought stays where it is. You can get better educated, as they call it. You can know more facts. But you still have the spatial view. There is a locale from which you operate. As long as that's true, some of you should see that it's metaphorical right quick, and then it's about, 200 or 300 miles past Metaphoricalville. There's no longer metaphorical. It's fact. That there's nothing else possible. You are limited to local reality. You're limited to one view. Apparently, the vistas are larger, but it's from this one position makes it one view. It makes it a personal view, it makes it a local view, and etc. And you can be rich and you can be famous, which is fine. But it will not allow you to scratch that place in your brain that will assume that most of you are itching, or else you just stumbled in here by accident. I can't resist a little more of this. I'll re-quote myself, make it additional assaults on local views. I may have done it poetically, but Anyway, some of you liked, I think I had those Kyroots writings come out with it, that it was like coal trains come and go, but the whelks are forever. You know, that is, you know, Roshan Roland Kirks come and go, but Guy Lombardo's are forever. And it got a laugh. All right, but how about this? Salieri's come and go, but Mozart's are forever. You see, if you got a spatial position, your reaction in either case, if you were listening and followed the little metaphorical intent, is your intelligence wants to say, yeah, yeah. The good, you know, the coal trains and the birds and the Roshans, the good die young. The Philistines seem to just hold on forever. Lawrence Welk, his band will still be playing when he's dead. They'll stuff him and they'll carry him around. And there are plenty of views. Life is wired up enough that will say that it's always the dunderheads, the Peckerwoods, the Pancho Pilots of the world, the Athenian Senates that will take all the good guys, that the Senate will tell, you know, Dizzy, you're going to have to drink the hemlock, you got to go. That the good always die out. But yet, there is a large part of life's body through man that would go, yeah, with my second description, that the good do not actually die young. Everybody dies. But the hacks of the world, the Salieri's, they come and go. It's not the Miles Davises, or the Root Boy Slims, the real artists of the world. It is the hacks. We're surrounded by artistic and mental pygmies. So the Salieri's, they're the ones that come and go, but it's the Mozarts that are forever. It's obviously true. How often do you hear Salieri performed? His work's still around. I know somebody must every now and then. Mozart, turn on any classical station or go to any record store, CD store. Mozart has got to be probably the most performed composer in the world. So he has survived. Stands out. A whole history, a whole generation in Western music. The man just a giant, just overshadowed almost everybody. Him and a couple of more people there for a couple of generations. The Salieri's, people still know their name. As I said, surely he gets performed some. I've heard something by him. But in a sense, the Philistines, those of just dubious talent, the imitators, they're the ones that just come and go. History is just replete with them. But the really true geniuses do stand out. Yeah, all right, yeah. Do I have to point out the obvious if we got obvious people here seeing this? Hey, they both can't be true. Why not? No, they can't. Spatially, they cannot, because everyone knows this. Even Newton knew this. As far as I know, well, this and Euclid, they hadn't replaced this or repealed these yet, that two things cannot occupy the same what? Space, yeah. But two things can occupy the same what? Guess. Because when you get into the temporal side, you should know, well, I keep hinting. Not only can two things occupy the same time, all things can occupy the same time. Not science fiction. The past is still alive in your nervous system. Your grandmother, your grandfather, Attila. Some of you, I hate to say it, but I can see little glimmers of Salieri popping up in some of you. Maybe a little Mozart in some of you. some of James Brown's grandfather. It is only within the limits of space, that is the linear thinking and operations of life as everyone knows it. Here, and apparently out there, and then here, apparently in here. The only way that humans serve this singular purpose, this visible, sensual purpose on this planet, is that they can move, apparently internally, in space without actually doing anything. That is, they can think of acting as opposed to always having to act. That if it were not for the higher end of the nervous system, the so-called intellect, then humans would be in the same position as any higher beast, any essential beast on the planet, that they would either be acting or not acting. And that's it. Either moving or not moving, running or just laying there. Humans could not be doing what they're doing if they did not have the other possibility. That is, they can move spatially without moving the whole organism. They can move here, that is, they can think, and as they call it, plan, and as they call it, as you always called it, even think about the future. You're thinking about space. You're not thinking about the future. Oh, you can say you're thinking about it. I can't stop you, everybody does, but you're not. All you're doing is thinking about, how am I going to clean up from where I am now? How am I going to clean up from where yesterday, that is, other people's yesterday, is here, and now I've got to clean up the damn place. Or, boy, what have I done? Now I got to clean up after myself. Now I got to go apologize. Now I got to go tell them again what kind of guy I am. All of you should be able to find your own. You should be able to do it continually until it begins to have a kind of chemical specific effect. It's to realize that life is full of this. It's not just up to me to bring them up, but the one I did that, coal trains come and go, but goddamn the Lawrence Welks are forever. And you go, yeah, I know what you mean. That's a heavy metaphor. Or if you don't like music, I guess I could use somebody else. The Balzacs come and go, but the Mickey Spillanes are forever. Don't make me push on. And you can go, yeah, that's true. In your field, whatever it was, that the people of no originality, the people of no real consequence, are the ones that seem to just hang on, live forever, keep getting in everybody else's way, and the fleeting geniuses, the intellectual and artistic comets, it's like they just flash by and they're just too soon gone. Died before their time, they always like to say. Which, and you go, yeah, there's no doubt, no doubt. And yet just the opposite is right there. That it's the hacks of the world that go. Sure, somebody may remember their name, but the only reason that they remember their name is because they were such a disposable commodity, that their art was such an ephemeral fad. That's the only reason we remember. 20 years from now, who will remember Mickey Spillane? Somebody will. There'll be some kind of footnote about here. Is a perfect example of the kind of dreck and schlock that was being put out in the Western world circa 1950, 1960. That's the only way he'll be remembered. But a Balzac, look, the man is still regarded. Takes up whole nice, good sections, I'm sure, still of undergraduate European lit. The man is revered, whether you read him or not. So you can go, that's true. That is true. In art and music, the only reason, literature, the only reason that these books are classics, the only reason that this music is called classical music is that this little bit, the Bachs, the Haydns, all right, Wagner. The only reason they survive, the only reason we call them classics, the only reason we call Shakespeare a classic, the only reason we call the Greek philosophers, the playwrights classics, is because they did survive. They stood the test of time. The rest of them, who remembers them? Other than maybe some footnote about how terrible they were. From any spatial position, internally, it can't be both ways. Now, I'm not going to stand here and keep beating on this, and it's not wordplay, but you should be able to do this on your own and realize that this is part of the inhalation and exhalation of life. This is part of the circulatory system of life, that this is going on. It's running through you, and you're running through it. It is part of what keeps life going, that one of those is true. And assuming you were following me the way I presented it, I'll take enough credit that either one of those, if I'd present it by themselves and said, the birds come and go and the whelks are forever, you go, yeah. Or if that's all I'd done and then went ahead and made some commentary on that. But I could have equally said, hey, the whelks come and go, but a Charlie Parker, man, forever. You go, yeah. But to realize that you are surrounded by that, it is surrounded by you. But the response of the thinking mechanism is that, well, one is definitely true. And if you just heard one, you could have heard one and said, yes, that's definitely true if I'd done it one way, or you could have heard it and went, that's definitely false. But both of them are really insufficient data. Because they're both true. That is, if you can see that they're both true, which I'm assuming you can from me doing this again tonight, that yes, they're both valid. Then if that's so, then whatever your ordinary reaction and anybody else's would have been, that is, that, yeah, how true, or yes, yeah, how false, they're not definitely true or definitely false. Both of those are really saying insufficient data. Because if they can be both true and false, then from the position of some more radical universal view, you've got to see, just a few people, not everybody else, but you got to see that something should be subject to further scrutiny. That is, all of my definite no's and all of my definite yeses are actually insufficient data. That's all it can be. Which is absolutely spatially illogical, and yet, temporally speaking, it could not be more reasonable. Because that's the way it is. Let me pick up a piece of something I mentioned last time we were taping. You need to have your own, if you're going to pursue this kind of stuff, your own kind of operational memory, because it's fairly easy to see. Enough of you saw it the other night, but you need an operational memory of the fact that you cannot see, you cannot use time, that is the future, using spatial technology. You cannot measure it. You cannot tell where you are. Oh, sure you can, because you are where you are. You're in the midst. You are the focal point. You are your own local environment. You are your own local reality. But you cannot tell where you are in any new playing field, in any new cleared building site. You cannot measure what the future is. You cannot think about the future. You cannot think in the future if all of your measurements are spatial technology. Okay, you know I can make a crude allegory, can I? You're attempting, in your case, an individual case, manned space flight using a Vespa or a soapbox racer. Now you can be as sincere as hell, and you can have a soapbox racer that make them want to erect a monument to you up in Akron, Ohio. But you do understand there's no possibility. I think I can say this without much fear of being contradicted. You can have the world's fastest motor scooter, and you can clean it up. You can supercharge it if you could get a turbo unit on it. You can put mag wheels on it. You can do anything you want to, but you do understand that you're not going to launch on a motor scooter. You cannot measure or use the actual future. You can't even think in the future if you're measuring where you are, what you're thinking, using outdated, which it is, technology. You can't even measure it. I would suggest, if none of you put it together around that particular sector, that is another verbal explanation I can give of why people say, life has made so many people say that the most important thing and the most worthwhile thing you could do is learn to know yourself. But boy, is that a hard task. I just don't think it's possible, says many people. Under many conditions, that passes for being a more intellectual view, is to say, well, I have really tried to live by that, and I'm going to tell you the truth, I feel like that the progress I may have made since my early college days is just minuscule. That passes for being more intelligent. Somebody says, well, yes, one time I read one of those books about old times back somewhere, and they said that the most important thing was know yourself. And I thought, by God, that's true. And so I tried real hard, and I thought about myself and looked around, and I took notice of it, and I kind of meditated, and I got introspective there for 2 or 3 weeks. And it was really worthwhile. The former would even pass, you understand that, for being more intellectual, to say, I am sold on the idea, for whatever reason that they may feel they had, that it would be a benefit to know myself. But I'm going to tell you, that is a Herculean task. I've been doing that. That's been on my mind. It's been one of my projects now for 40 years, and I feel as though I had just started. I suggest to you why. Just one of the other explanations. There is no reason why, because this is just simply energy moving. It comes out in ideas that man should know himself. The unexamined life is not worth living. And people say, yes, but it's so hard to examine your life. It's so hard to know yourself. They're trying to measure. They're trying to look at themselves. It's like the paper trying to look at itself. It's you, if you're ordinary, trying to, while walking about in search of something, and it turns out that what you're in search of is the soles of your feet. You're using the wrong measurement. If indeed there was real validity, if indeed it could simply be described that the object is to know yourself, then you can't even measure where you are, you can't measure what you are, you can't measure what know is, you can't measure what the word self is, if you're using technology that is not pertinent. I guess we can forget if you got to jump from motor scooters and space travel. If somebody says, hey, we need to end up this tape, we've got about 7 minutes left, so, or I don't know how much time we got, so would somebody tell me when 5 minutes is, we're close to 5 minutes of this tape being up. And if I try and look at you and say, will you do it? And you went, yeah. And I looked around and you said, a minute. And I said, you know, the time. And I looked at you and you went, how am I going to make it up? You cannot measure, even in the ordinary sense, temporal affairs spatially. And that's exactly what the human intellect, that's part of what keeps it churned, that's what keeps it thinking about acting, that's what keeps things apparently flip-flopping, like the slinky down the stairs, except humans seem to be going upstairs, that one thing falls over the other and it pulls the rest of it behind it. But it is having outdated, faulty, inappropriate measuring technology and devices, known as intellect, emotions, motor skills. I went up in ascending order because the motor skills are closer, assuming that you don't walk around every day breaking your own leg or sticking yourself in the eye when you're shaving or washing your face in the morning, you rip your nose out with your fingernail. If you're just fairly sane physically, then it has a reasonable way to measure itself and get through life. But you start getting up into the areas that seem to be singularly human, into so-called human emotions and the human intellect, and then part of the trick is, part of this beautiful arrangement that life has, is you then attempt, as you're supposed to be measuring, stating what kind of guy you are, what you think about life, your opinions of this and that, and you're measuring. There's no cause for sarcasm, no cynicism, but everybody at that level, everybody is attempting to look around and either to themselves or to asking other people or responding to other people. They're continually, they're saying, well, I think this kind of project in my life should take, about that long. The ordinary so-called emotional responses, the ordinary thinking processes are using outdated technology. And specifically, what I was trying to get you to see based upon the ways I've been describing it for the last several tapings, is you are attempting temporal measurements using spatial technology. That is what ordinary thought is. That is what, no matter what I've been calling it, earthbound thought, gravity thought, old intelligence, that's exactly what it is. And that's why people cannot know themselves. That's one explanation, one way to look at it. That is why people cannot think in the future. That's why the futuristic magazines, you know, an interview with the world's greatest futurist, they have to ask him, well, how'd you get to be a futurist? And you got to talk about how you got there. It's the reason. Because they say, well, we're trying to think about the future. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to let my imagination just run wild. I'm going to write the greatest science fiction, the greatest futuristic novel in the world. I'll just let myself go. No holds barred. And I got an intellect. I've read all kinds of stuff, and I've had crazy dreams, and I've smoked all kinds of stuff, and eaten all kinds of stuff in the past, and I got my own neural network probably a little screwed up. And so I'll just sit down, and I'll let my mind just fly out into the universe, out into the future. You're attempting to fly with a motor scooter. You're attempting to measure, to gauge what might be the future, to predict the future, to say that you're thinking in the future. You're doing it with spatial technology. That's why it never seems to come out. That's why it seems to be a sitting duck for me to say that, you know, the first thing that they ask a futurist, the most famous futurist, is, how'd you get to be a futurist? Well, when I was 7 years old. But when you apparently think about the future, once you can see it, it's not an attack. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's the way it is. When you even think that you're thinking of the future, you're not thinking about the future. It's the PP, it's the past present, continually crying out. Well, it's all the same. There was no intended or unintended scatological pun there. But it is this non-existent, spatial present, which is still the past, continually crying out to history, crying out to yesterday, even when it's apparently talking about tomorrow, when it says it is talking about the future. Now, I said that you couldn't measure time with spatial technology. The person over here in charge of the taping just went, which I take it to mean, what do I take that to mean? I don't know. I don't guess we have to worry about that each and every time that I have to make some ersatz brilliant sudden segue into the final closing minutes and say, well, that reminds me. There was a physicist and a biologist and a botanist were waiting on a bus. Of course, it's obvious I don't have to finish this and give the punchline to you people, because you see how it's directly tied into what I've been talking about. Love it, love it, love it.